No one wed the 33-year-old whose voice was lost. A mute cobbler signed, I do. The first boot I ever fixed that mattered was my father's. He'd thrown it at my mother on a Tuesday. Not hard, he wasn't that kind of man, not in his body anyway, just the way a man throws something when he's got nothing left to throw that'll hit right. It skidded across the kitchen floor and came to rest against the stove leg, and she stepped over it like it was a stone in the road. I was 6. I picked it up. The heel was loose. Had been for months, the way things in our house went loose gradually, the way we didn't fix them because fixing things cost money or time or the acknowledgement that something had gone wrong. I found the small tin of Cobbler's tacks my father kept on the back porch shelf. He kept everything on that shelf, nails, wire, a broken compass he never fixed either. And I sat down on the cold kitchen floor with that boot in my lap, and I tapped those tacks in one at a time, because I had no tool that fit, only a smooth river stone I used as a hammer, and I got 4 tacks in before my mother noticed what I was doing. She stood over me for a long moment. I remember the hem of her dress, the way it moved and then stopped. She said, Elias. That was all. But she said it the way you say a name when it means something more than just calling to a person. Like she was taking note of who I was, right then, and storing it somewhere safe. I don't know if she did store it. She died 3 years later and took whatever she'd stored with her. But that's how I knew what I was. I was someone who picked up the boot. I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to sit with it before you decide what it means. I have not spoken a word since I was 19 years old. Not a whisper, not a yes or a no, not my own name when somebody asked it, nothing. It isn't that I can't. That's the part people never get right. They see me and they think sickness, accident, something broke and wouldn't mend. A few of them have said it to my face, which is a peculiar thing to do to a man who can't answer you back, but people do peculiar things when they're uncomfortable. They fill the silence with whatever explanation lets them stop thinking about it. The truth is simpler and harder than any of that. I decided. I was 19 and I was standing in a courtroom in Guthrie, Oklahoma, and I had been asked to testify against a man named Birch Calloway who had beaten my employer, Mr. Steen, into a condition he did not recover from. I had seen it. I was the only one who had seen it. And I opened my mouth in that courtroom, with the judge looking down at me and the lawyers in their coats and the whole room waiting. And Birch Calloway looked at me from across that room with a kind of flat, patient, permanent attention that said very clearly, I know where you sleep. Not a threat, threats are spoken. This was something older than speech. And I closed my mouth. And Calloway walked free. And Mr. Steen's wife had to sell the shop on 2nd Street because there was nobody to run it. And she moved to her sister's in Amarillo. And I stayed in Guthrie with the knowledge of what I had not said, which felt like a stone in my chest that grew a little heavier every morning. I tried to speak after that. For about 6 weeks I tried. The words were there, I could feel them pressing at the inside of my throat, but every time I went to say them I thought of that flat, patient look, and the words turned to nothing, like trying to light a match in wet weather. After 6 weeks I stopped trying. After 6 months, I stopped thinking of it as something I'd lost. I was a cobbler's apprentice when all this happened, which is the only trade I knew. The cobbler I'd apprenticed under after Mr. Steen was a German named Horst who had a shop in Enid, and who, it turned out, did not mind a quiet worker. Minded it less and less, in fact, as time went on and he discovered that a man who doesn't talk also doesn't argue, doesn't gossip, doesn't complain about the quality of the leather or the unreasonableness of a customer. Horst himself talked enough for any 2 men, so we got on. I stayed with him 4 years. Learned everything he knew about lasting and welting and the particular art of reading a worn sole, what it tells you about how a person carries themselves, where they've been, what work they do, whether they favor one leg. I was good at it, am good at it. That's not pride talking, that's just the truth of what I am. When Horst died a fast death, his heart, on a February morning with frost on the inside of the shop windows, I found I had enough put by to take over the lease. His son in Wichita didn't want it. So the shop became mine, and I stayed on in Enid, and I was 28 years old, and I had a trade and a roof and nothing else, and that was all right. That was all right. I want to be honest about this part because it would be easy to tell it as sadder than it was. People assume a man alone and silent must be in agony. Mostly I wasn't. I had my work. I had a room above the shop with a good stove and a window that looked west so I could watch the light leave in the evenings. I had a cat for a year until she wandered off. I had the boots, which told me everything about the people in this town, whether they wanted me to know it or not. There was a man who came in twice a year with soles worn down on the outside edge of both feet, a rolling walk, bow-legged, spent his days in a saddle. A schoolteacher whose shoes were resoled so many times the uppers were the only original thing left, which told me something about what the county paid its teachers. A preacher with a hole worn through the right heel, always the right heel, from a habit of tapping it when he was nervous, which I found interesting in a preacher. Widow Garza, who came in every spring with her husband's work boots to have them cleaned and polished and wrapped in brown paper to put back in a box. Year after year. The same boots, never worn, just kept. I knew this town through its soles, and the town knew me as the mute cobbler, which was fine. Better than most names a man can carry. What I did not have, what I will not pretend I did not notice the absence of, was someone who came home to me. Not a wife, not even the idea of one, mostly. I was not under any delusion that a woman was going to sit across a supper table from a man who would never say a word to her and find that an acceptable life. I had seen how women looked at me when they understood. There was a kind of pity that was the worst kind, the kind that's almost contempt dressed in softer clothes. And there was occasionally a woman who found it interesting for about 20 minutes, like I was a curiosity at a fair, and then the interest passed. I was 33 years old and I understood my situation clearly, and I had made my peace with it. Or I believed I had. Peace is a thing you discover you didn't quite have when something comes along and disturbs it. She came into the shop on a Thursday in October with a pair of men's boots. They were large boots, a man's size 11, the leather dried and cracked from neglect, the stitching coming away from the welt on the left side. She set them on my counter without a word of preamble, which was already different. Most people, when they come to me, feel obligated to talk more than usual to make up for what they've calculated I'm not contributing. They explain things that don't need explaining. They fill. She didn't fill. She set the boots down and she looked at them, and then she looked at me and she said, "Can they be saved?" She was maybe 30, somewhere in there. Brown hair pinned up but not carefully, the kind of pinning that started neat in the morning and had been forgotten about since. A practical face, not remarkable in any one feature but solid in the way a good piece of work is solid. Good bones. Her coat was clean but old. A widow's coat, I thought, and then I thought, no, just a woman who takes care of what she has. I picked up the boots, turned them over, examined the welt, the upper, the counter, the stiff part at the heel that holds the shape, pressed on the sole to feel how it flexed, pulled the tongue back and looked at the lining. Then I took a pad of paper from under the counter, I keep it there, this is not unusual in my shop, and wrote, "They can. The left welt needs resewing. Conditioning throughout, 3 days." She read it without the eyebrow thing. Some people raise an eyebrow at the notepad, like they're surprised I've found a workaround for existing in the world. She just read it and nodded. "What's the cost?" I wrote it. "That's fair." She looked at the boots again. "They were my father-in-law's. He passed in the spring. My husband thought they should go to waste. I didn't." I waited to see if she'd say more. She didn't. I wrote, "I'll have them ready by Saturday." She nodded, started to go. Then at the door she turned and looked back at the counter, at the boots, not at me, and said, "He was a good man. Worn things deserve care." And then she left. I held that for a while after she was gone, the way you hold something to check its weight. Her name was Cora Pell, I found out. Not from her, from Martin Abel at the feed store next door, who knew everything about everyone in Enid and could not stop himself from sharing it. She'd come into town in the spring with her husband, a man named Douglas Pell, who had some idea about establishing a cattle operation on a piece of land east of town that turned out to be worse land than advertised. The cattle operation failed by midsummer. Douglas Pell, rather than reclassify that failure as information and proceed accordingly, had reclassified it as something wrong with the town and the people in it and everything except himself. And by September he had departed for somewhere else, leaving Cora with a leased house and about $40 and the announcement that he'd send for her once he was back on his feet. Martin Abel gave me this information across the fence while I was eating my lunch, and I listened without expression, which is all I can offer. He said, "She's taken in laundry, doing all right from what I hear, doesn't complain." I went back inside and finished my bread. I thought about what she'd said. Worn things deserve care, not a profound statement. Women say things like that all the time, small, dignifying sentences about old objects. But the way she'd said it, looking at those boots, not at me like she meant it particularly, like it was specific rather than general. I told myself I was reading into it. I can go long stretches without thinking much about women. This is not bitterness or resignation. It's just that after enough time alone, the mind stops going to places it can't reach. Like a river that learns to run around a stone. But she put a small crack in that, not an ache, not that dramatic, just a hairline crack where air got in. I finished the boots on Friday afternoon, a day early. They came out better than I expected. The leather took the conditioning well, drank it in like it had been waiting. I spent an extra hour on them because I had the time and because they were worth it. The old man who'd worn them had cared for them himself once, you could tell. The repairs done along the way by someone who knew what he was doing. 2 patches on the lining I hadn't seen at first. The kind of patches a man makes with materials at hand rather than what a cobbler would use. A little rough but solid, and I didn't replace them, just strengthened what was there. I wrapped them in brown paper and set them on the shelf behind the counter. She came Saturday morning, while it was still cold enough to see breath. I unwrapped them for her, watched her face. She picked up the left boot, turned it over, ran her thumb along the new welt stitching, set it down and picked up the right. Then she set both of them together on the counter, side by side, and looked at them for a moment without speaking. "He would have been pleased," she said, and I believed her. She paid me and I gave her change, and she was wrapping them back in the paper when she stopped and looked up at me with a direct, level look. "Do you take on regular work?" she said. "I've a pair of my own that need attention, and 2 pairs of work boots that belong to a man who owed my husband money that we got in lieu of payment. I'd rather keep them than sell them for less than they're worth. Could probably use them around the property." I wrote, "Bring them in." "Not this week," she said. "I've got laundry orders, maybe in 2 weeks." I nodded. She left. At the door she didn't pause this time, and I told myself that was fine, that was normal. That was how a woman leaving a shoe shop was supposed to look. She came back in 2 weeks, as she'd said she would. This is the kind of thing I notice. People say they'll come back and they don't, not because they're dishonest, just because life turns differently than planned, and then they feel guilty about it and don't come in for months. Or they come back weeks late with an apologetic air like they owe me an explanation, which I neither require nor know how to receive gracefully. Cora came back exactly when she'd said, with her shoes in a cloth bag and the 2 pairs of work boots in a canvas sack, and she put them on the counter and said, "What needs doing?" I went through them all. Made notes. Her own shoes were plain calfskin, well-made once, the soles thin from a lot of walking. One of the work boots had a steel shank that was loose, which could turn an ankle if it shifted wrong. The other pair was in decent shape, but the stitching on the vamp was pulling. I showed her the notes. She read them carefully, asked me to point to the loose shank on the work boot, which I did. She picked up the boot and pressed on the sole until she could feel the shank move, and her jaw set in a way I recognized, the jaw set of a person discovering something that should have been caught sooner. "How long before someone falls?" she said. I held up 2 fingers, 2 more months of hard use, maybe. "Then do those first." She set the boot back down. "I'm going to tell you something, mister," she stopped. "I don't know your name." I wrote Elias Drum. "Mr. Drum," she said it the way my mother had said mine, that one time, which was probably coincidence and probably not something I should have noticed. "I'm going to tell you something that is none of your business, but I find I'm saying it anyway. My husband has not sent for me. He may not. I am managing and I intend to go on managing, but I need to be smart about things, and I can't afford to have anyone fall because a shank let go." I nodded. "Good," she said. "That's settled then." She paid a deposit on the work and left without hurrying, and I turned back to my bench and I sat there for a moment with a curved needle in my hand, and I thought, she's practical. That's all. She's a practical woman managing a difficult situation, and she's treating me like a serviceable tradesman, which is what I am, and that is the entirety of it. I believed this for about a week. She started coming in roughly every 2 or 3 weeks. Not always with shoes, sometimes she'd have a single boot with a problem, a question written on a slip of paper. Once a piece of leather she'd bought at the dry goods store and wanted to know if it was right for a harness repair. She was attempting herself. I told her it wasn't too thin, it would stretch, and I showed her the weight she needed, and she listened with her arms crossed and her head slightly tilted, which was how she listened to things she was taking in and organizing. We developed a way of talking. She talked, I wrote, but she learned to read me as well, and that was the thing I hadn't expected. The things I couldn't write, the lifted chin that meant I disagreed, the slight flattening of my mouth when a customer was being unreasonable, the way I set down a tool when I was thinking instead of working. She read these without comment, without making a show of understanding, just incorporated them into the conversation the way you incorporate a pause. It took her 3 visits to stop waiting for me to feel the need to fill my silence with extra writing. Some people never stop waiting for it. They treat the silence as an absence, something wrong, and they hover around the edges of it anxiously. She figured out that it wasn't an absence. It was just how I was made. After that, she talked to me the way she might talk to someone who was present and listening, which is all I'd ever wanted. In November, she brought in a pair of children's boots, small ones, maybe a 7-year-old size, and I looked at her with a question, and she said, "The Kettner girl. Her mother does laundry with me. The family's about done in. Those need to last the winter." I did them that evening off the clock, resoled both, lined the inside with a scrap of sheepskin I'd been saving, set them back in the bag. When she came for them 2 days later, she looked in the bag, and then she looked at me, and I could see her doing the math, the work that had been done, the price we hadn't discussed. I shook my head. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm not going to argue with you." "No," I wrote and then crossed it out. I don't know why I crossed it out. She'd already read it. She folded the top of the bag over carefully, and she said, "You're a good man, Elia's drum." And she walked out in the November cold with the Kettner girl's boots under her arm. I stood at the window and watched her go down the street, and I stood there longer than I should have. Winter came in hard that year, 2 feet of snow in December, and then a cold snap that turned everything to iron. Business slowed. People stayed home. The shop was quiet for days at a time, just the stove ticking and the sound of my own work. She didn't come for 3 weeks. I told myself this was normal. 3 weeks in a snow winter meant nothing. She had her laundry work and her house, and whatever else she was managing. On the 23rd day, I walked past the post office, and Martin Abel was shoveling his walk, and without my asking, he said, "The Pell woman's sick. Word is she's got something in her chest. Mrs. Kettner's been checking in on her." I went back to my shop. I heated soup on the stove. I'm not much of a cook, but I can heat soup, and I had a pot of it that I'd made from a ham bone and whatever else was in the house. I put it in a jar with a tight lid. I put on my coat and my hat, and I walked through 8 inches of new snow to the address I'd heard Martin Abel mention once in passing in September when he was telling me something else, and which I had apparently filed away without being aware of it. It was a small frame house on Elm, second from the corner. Smoke coming from the chimney, so the stove was going. I knocked. A woman I didn't know opened the door, Mrs. Kettner. I assumed older, tired-looking. I held up the jar and pointed past her into the house. She looked at me and then at the jar and said, "You're the cobbler," and stepped aside. Cora was in the front room in a chair pulled up near the stove, wrapped in a quilt. Her face was pale and her eyes were bright in the fever way, and when she saw me, she did something I hadn't seen her do before. She looked relieved. Not politely glad to have a visitor. Actually relieved, the way a person looks when they were holding something tense inside them, and something lets them release it a little. "Elia's," she said. I held up the jar. She smiled, and it was a different smile than any I'd seen from her in the shop. Not the practical smile, not the almost amused by something smile. This one was just simple and open, and it did something to my chest that I was not prepared for. "I didn't want to send for anyone," she said. "It seemed like making a fuss." "I thought you almost didn't." I looked at Mrs. Kettner and held my palms up, a question. 3 days, Mrs. Kettner said. "Wasn't eating. She started eating this morning." I nodded. I pulled the spare chair from against the wall and I sat down across from Cora and I looked at her. And for a while we just stayed like that, the stove ticking and the wind outside and her fever color in the lamplight. After a while she said, "I keep thinking it'll break and then it doesn't." I lifted my chin. "It will." "You don't know that." I looked at her steadily. I know you, is what I was trying to say. I've watched you come into my shop and work things out in your head and not complain and not make yourself smaller than you are. You're the kind of woman who breaks fevers. She didn't get all of that, of course. I can't say all of that with a look, but she got enough. All right, she said, and leaned her head back against the chair. I stayed an hour. Mrs. Kettner made tea, and I drank some of it and didn't leave until the soup was warm and Cora had eaten half the jar, and I could see the line of her shoulders loosen slightly, the held quality going out of them. At the door I paused and looked back. She'd fallen asleep in the chair already, the quilt pulled up to her chin. Her face in sleep was plainer and younger, the practical expression gone. I walked home in the dark and the cold, and I stopped pretending. I want to tell you what it's like, being a silent man in a small town in the Oklahoma Territory at the turn of one century into the next. People talk around you. This is not a complaint. It's just what happens. You become a kind of fixed point, and conversations happen near you the way they might happen near a fence post, easily, without consideration for whether the fence post is listening. You learn a great many things. You learn more about a town's true weather than anyone who's out in it talking. What you don't learn, what you can't get from any amount of listening, is what it's like to be known. Not known in the way Martin Abel knows you, by your facts, your habits, the broad outlines of your story. Known the way you're known when someone looks at you and sees what's under the habit and the next thing under that. That particular knowledge. The kind that takes time and stillness and the willingness to look without rushing to label. I had not been known like that since my mother, and she'd only had 3 years of it before she died. What I'm saying is, I understood what was happening to me with Corapel. I wasn't a young man, I wasn't foolish. I'd had enough years of solitude to know the difference between wanting a thing in the abstract and the particular want that comes when the thing is in front of you and is a specific person. I knew what it was. I also knew that her husband had not sent for her and also had not officially released her, and that whatever I felt was not the kind of thing you acted on with a married woman in a small town in 1901. Not because of what the town would say, I'd given up a good deal of caring what the town said, but because of her, what a thing like that would cost her. So I did nothing. I went on doing nothing very carefully all through January. February. She was well by then, back on her feet, back to the laundry and the occasional visit to the shop. The fever had left her thinner but not different, the same level gaze, the same economy of movement, the same quality of looking at things straight rather than sideways. If anything, the illness had stripped away some small remaining politeness from her interactions, and what was left underneath was more direct. She came in on a Thursday with one of the work boots, the one with the repaired steel shank, and set it on the counter. The shank shifted again, she said. I picked it up, it had, not badly, but it would. I made a note of it and looked at the boot more carefully. The problem was the platform the shank sat on. The insole had softened from water, probably from working through snow and wet. I'd need to replace the insole entirely. I wrote all this out. She read it, then she said, "Tell me something." I waited. Has anyone ever told you that you're easier to talk to than most men who talk? I looked at her. I didn't know what to write to that. She wasn't looking at me with the pity kind of look or the curiosity kind. She was looking at me with the straight look she had for everything, and what was in it was, I'm going to say this plainly, regard. The specific kind, not the general. I mean it, she said. I've had 14 years of listening to a man talk and say very little. I'm not sure I'd have noticed before, but I notice now. I wrote after a moment, it's easy when you can't fill the space. She shook her head, that's not what it is. And she was right, that wasn't what it was, but I didn't know yet how to say what it was. She left the boot, and I spent the afternoon working on it, and I did not think clearly about anything all afternoon. In March, Douglas Pell appeared. He came into the shop, which I thought was a strange choice. He was a square-built man, not tall but wide, with a reddish face and the bearing of someone who's used to deciding things. He looked around the shop with the look of a man appraising something he might want to acquire or might want to dismiss. He hadn't decided yet. He said, "You're the cobbler." I nodded. "You know my wife?" I nodded. He leaned on the counter. "I want you to know I'm back. We're sorting some things out. I don't know what she's told you, but whatever it is." He stopped. He'd run up against the fact that whatever she'd told me was not available to him through me. Not by asking, not by any means. Something moved across his face that wasn't embarrassment exactly. More like displeasure at encountering a situation he couldn't enter the way he was used to entering situations. He straightened up. "I'm taking care of my family," he said. I met his eyes and I held them and I didn't look away. And after a moment he was the one who looked away, out at the street, and then back. "Just so you know," he said and left. I stood at the counter for a while after he'd gone. I wasn't afraid of him, that wasn't it. I'm going to say this honestly, I was sad in a way that had a very particular texture, like a settled thing. The kind of sad that isn't dramatic, just factual, like seeing the sky when it's about to close in. She'd made no promise to me. I'd made no claim. There was nothing between us except some boots and some notes on a pad and a jar of soup in February. The most I could tell myself was that she'd said I was easy to talk to and she'd looked at me with regard. That was what there was. It wasn't enough to grieve over, so I didn't grieve. I went back to the bench and I worked. She came in the following week. There was something in her face I hadn't seen there before. Not the illness pallor, not distress exactly. A kind of closed quality, like shutters put up not because of a storm that had arrived, but because of one that was being tracked on the horizon and might or might not come. She put a small pair of shoes on the counter. Children's shoes, these weren't the Kettner girls, they were nicer. "Mine," she said. "When I was small, I don't know why I kept them. I want to know if anything can be done with them." I picked them up. They were 50 years old if they were a day, the leather brittle in places but the construction still sound in the essentials. I turned them over in my hands. I wrote, "I can stabilize them, keep them from going further. They won't be wearable again, but they'll last." She nodded, then she didn't move, just stood at the counter, and I waited. "He's back," she said. "Finally." I wrote, "I know, he came here." She looked up sharply. "What did he say?" I wrote it out. She read it, her jaw did the thing, then she said, "He would." She was quiet for a moment. "I haven't decided anything, I want you to know that." I wasn't sure what I was supposed to do with that, so I just nodded. "I owe you nothing on this," she said. "I know that, and you don't owe me anything either." She was looking at the small shoes on the counter. "I just wanted to say it out loud, that I haven't decided, because I have been walking around this town making it look like it's already decided because that's easier and she stopped. "I'm tired of making it look easier than it is." I wrote, after a moment, "You don't have to make it look easy here." She read it. She didn't say anything, but the closed quality in her face shifted just slightly, like a shutter opened a quarter inch. She paid for the shoes in advance and left, and I put them somewhere I could see them from the bench. I need to tell you about a thing I did not do, because it matters. I did not send word to her. I did not reach out. I did not put myself in her way or let her know what I felt or try in any manner to influence what she was deciding. This wasn't nobility, or not only that. It was I thought about it and I thought about it, all through March, while she didn't come into the shop and I assumed she was working through whatever she was working through, and what I came back to was this. A woman making a decision about her life doesn't need a mute cobbler putting his thumb on the scale. What she needs is to make the decision without being managed, and if the decision went to her husband, then that was her decision and I wasn't going to taint it by having pushed. And if it went the other way, well, I'd waited 33 years to be chosen by someone who saw me straight. I could wait a little more. So I waited, I fixed boots, I watched the spring come in. She came back on a Thursday in April, on a morning when the sky was that particular clean-washed color that the territory gets after a week of rain. And she came in carrying nothing, no shoes, no bag, just herself. She stood at the counter and she looked at me and she said, "He left again, 3 days ago." I waited. I didn't ask him to and I didn't ask him to stay. She said this flatly, like a set of facts. "He went because that's what he does. I've stopped thinking of it as something that reflects on me." I wrote, "It doesn't." "I know that now." She put both hands on the counter, not leaning, just placed them there, deliberate. "I want to say something to you and I need you not to be, I need you to just let me say it." I put the pencil down. "I've been in this town for a year," she said. "I've known a lot of people to varying degrees. I have one neighbor I trust and one cobbler I trust, and that cobbler is you." She looked at me very directly. "I know you're silent by choice and I've never asked why because it's yours to not say. I know you work well and you think clearly and you're kinder than you let on. I know you sat in my house for an hour in February without needing anything from me in return. She paused. I know you kept my childhood shoes. She had noticed. Of course she had noticed. I'm not asking you for anything. This is not a proposal. She stopped, started again. I am saying that if you had any interest in knowing me better, I would like that. That's all. You can write no, and I'll take the shoes when they're ready, and we can go on as we've been. I looked at her. She looked back. Her hands were still flat on the counter, steady, but I could see the small effort that steadiness was costing her. Not fear, not anxiety exactly, just the particular tension of a person who has said a true thing out loud and is waiting to find out what it lands on. I picked up the pencil. I had been thinking for a long time about what I would write if I ever had the chance to write it. I'd had many versions, careful ones explaining myself, longer ones that tried to give her the context, the courtroom, the 6 weeks, the wait. I had a version that started with my mother, and a version that started with Horst, and a version that started with nothing, because there was no beginning that would say it right. I wrote, I have been waiting 3 years to speak to someone who doesn't need me to fill the silence. I haven't found it until you. She read it, then she read it again. That's the most words you've ever put in front of me at once, she said. I nodded. She turned the pad to face her, smoothed it with one hand, and pushed it back across to me. Write more, she said. I'm going to tell you about a particular Sunday in June, about 2 months after that, because this is where the real part is. We'd been, I don't know the right word, keeping company, the old people would have said. She came to the shop more often. I came to her house on Elm on Sunday afternoons, and she'd cook something and I'd sit at her table and we'd talk the way we talked, her with words and me with the pad, and sometimes without either, just the two of us in a room being there. Her divorce papers came in May, which I understood had taken some doing, and some money she'd had to borrow from Mrs. Kettner, and she didn't make a ceremony of them, just told me they'd come. That Sunday in June, we'd walked out along the creek east of town. She liked the creek. It was a plain piece of water, muddy and unremarkable, but she'd been walking it since she took the house and knew all its turns. We were sitting on a rise above the bank where a cottonwood had come down years ago and left a good flat log for sitting on, and she said, out of nowhere particularly, "Have you thought about what you want?" I took out the pad. She put her hand on mine, not to stop me, just a hand on mine. Not everything needs to be written, she said. I looked at the creek. I thought about my father's boot on the kitchen floor, about the courtroom in Guthrie and Birch Calloway's flat, patient look and the words that had turned to nothing in my throat, about Mr. Steen's wife going to Amarillo, about Horst and the German that Horst talked and the way a good leather takes a needle, about the Kettner girl's boots and the sheepskin lining I'd saved, about Cora's face in February by the stove, the sleep-softened face, the relief when she'd seen me come through the door, about a man who picks up the boot. I turned my hand over under hers and held it, just held it. The creek went on below us, and the cottonwood was warm from the afternoon sun, and somewhere a long way off a meadowlark was working its particular piece of air. That was my answer. She seemed to understand it, because she didn't ask again. The question of marrying came up in July. I say it that way because it didn't come from one direction. It crept up on us from both sides simultaneously, the way a conclusion does when two people have been walking toward the same thing without discussing it. One Sunday she mentioned that Mrs. Kettner had asked whether we had plans, and I looked at her with a particular look, and she looked back, and after a moment she said, "I'm not opposed." I wrote, "Neither am I." She said, "It's not a romantic declaration." I wrote, "No, it's better than one." She considered this for a moment. "Yes," she said, "it is. I'm going to tell you about the day we signed the papers, because I want you to have it exactly." The justice of the peace in Enid was a man named Holloway, about 60, who had been doing this for 20 years, and had the calm efficiency of a man who has performed a ceremony enough times to do it without it becoming mechanical, which is a harder thing than it sounds. He had a nice room in the courthouse, not large, 2 chairs across from his desk and a window that looked out on the elm trees. We sat across from him. He went through the standard part, the questions, the rights, the obligations as recognized by the territory of Oklahoma. Cora answered in her voice. I had a card prepared in advance. I do this sometimes, for situations where a pad would be too slow, and when Holloway got to me, I held it up. It said yes. Holloway looked at it. He had been told I was mute. He nodded as though it were any other answer. Then he got to the part where you sign, and he pushed the register across the desk. I picked up the pen. I wrote my name. Elias James Drum, my hand steady, the pen scratching in the courthouse quiet. And then I felt her looking at me. Not at the register, not at the pen, at me. The particular direct look she had. I looked up. She was looking at me the way you look at something you've decided about. Not with happiness, exactly. Happiness is too quick a word, too temporary, with something more settled than that, something that had its feet under it. Like she was looking at a thing she intended to keep. I have had people look at me many ways in 33 years. Pity, confusion, the charity look, the curiosity look, the look that meant they'd already moved on to the next thing they'd rather be doing. No one had ever looked at me like they were staking a claim. It undid something in me that I hadn't known was still knotted up. I looked back at her as steadily as I could. She signed her name next to mine. Her handwriting was different than mine, rounder, more forward-leaning, the kind of handwriting you get from someone who learned in a schoolhouse from a teacher who cared about the letters. Cora Drum. She looked at it for a moment after she set the pen down. Then she looked at me. And she put her hand on the side of my face. Just briefly, just a moment, her palm warm against my jaw, not a performance, not for Holloway, just something she did, the way you touch something you mean to take care of. I put my hand over hers. The elm trees moved in the window. I want to tell you what it's like now, so you have the full picture. It's September, and we live on Elm Street in the house she rented, and then bought with what she'd saved, and what I'd saved together. And the stove that she knows better than I do is the center of the kitchen, the way a good stove should be. Her laundry work has stopped because it didn't need to continue, and what she does instead is run the books for the shop, which she does with a thoroughness and a precision that is better than anything I'd been doing myself. And she has opinions about pricing that are more often right than my opinions. The Kettner girl came in last week. She's 8 now, and she brought her own boots in on her own authority, which made Cora smile the particular smile. I resoled them and put new laces in, and the girl said thank you in a very solemn 8-year-old voice, and Cora said, "Thank Mr. Drum properly." And the girl looked at me and understood that properly meant something other than speaking, and she put her hand on the counter where mine was resting, just lightly, just for a moment, which is better than most thank yous. The boots that started it, the old man's boots, the ones she brought in that first Thursday, are on the shelf in our bedroom. She asked me once in the spring whether that was strange to keep them there, and I shook my head. They were the first thing that mattered. You keep those. She knows the story of the courtroom in Guthrie. I wrote it for her over the course of 3 Sunday evenings in August, more words than I'd written in any one stretch in years. And when I was done, she sat with it for a while without saying anything, and then she said, "He's still there." I nodded. "All right," she said, "then that's accounted for." That was all, no absolution, no grand statement. Just, that's accounted for, the way you account for a debt and then close the ledger. I don't know what she meant by it exactly. I think she meant, I know it now and it's part of you, and I've put it somewhere in my understanding of you, and now we go on. That's what I think she meant. She's asleep now, it's early morning. I'm at the bench before the shop opens, which is when I do my best work, the light coming in from the east window, the town not yet up and talking. In a while the bell above the door will ring and someone will come in with something that needs mending, and I'll do what I do. But right now it's quiet, and in the room above me my wife is asleep and the stove is warm, and I am a man who picked up the boot. That's the whole story. That's everything.